Now that we know technology works with our smartphones, I'm curious to see by what time my smartphone will be able to read my mind and I don't have to tap the answer. But that's for the future. And let's stay with the future. Another buzzword that we currently hear a lot is big data, predictive analytics. And this is probably something that our next speaker will cover for us. It is Michel Leonard. He's the Chief Executive Officer of Makro LLC, and he'll cover for us what can data science tell us about macro trends in the EU for 2017. Michel.
Thank you. It's right here. Good. Thank you so much. I'll wait for them to bring the presentation. I had the pleasure to speak about, I guess, at the beginning of this conference, about 8 years ago or something like that. So it's a pleasure to be here again, but it's also a pleasure to meet my friends at COFAS and the organizers. And they're all such a great group of people. And again, thank you for the invitation. I have to say, being the head of my own company, I can say, yes, they are my own views and they are the views of my company. Never been able to say that. Oh, I have to forward it? Okay, good. Oh, wonderful. Now I recognize it. Thank you. I knew this was going to happen. I don't have my glasses. Those of you who are my friends here know how that is. So I don't have my glasses, so I have to look up there. A few questions today. I was asked to talk about big data. You know, big data is not that complicated. It's telling me that it's not starting. Can you just turn this off entirely? Thank you. I was trying to see, I'm actually not that good with technology, only numbers. So what I wanted to do today was to talk a bit about big data. We all hear a lot about it, but it is unclear to us what it is. So what is it? It is nothing more than statistics and econometrics continuing its progress and its progression. When you hear alternative data, which is really the buzzword right now, it's exactly the same thing. Now, I'll talk a bit about these categories. So I thought it'd be interesting today to use some of the issues of the day, of the weekend, with the French election in the EU, to give you a hands-on feel on how does one use alternative data, big data, and so forth to enhance what we're already doing. So, question is, at the end of the day, this is all useful, but does it make us do something different? And I do think that in some cases, such as now, we do have some insight with the issues we've looked at. So I will look at the state elections in France, take a step back to the EU, and really at that point make a point on the importance of not just the elections, from Turkey to France presidential, to France legislative, to British parliamentary, and so forth. But when trying to understand the question of Europe today, we want to be focused on the underlying trend here that big data can really help with. Okay. Always start with credentials. So we are very glad to say that last week we had a great piece on Turkey, and our view basically ripped the consensus apart. We use insurance data. We use a lot of credit data, actually. We use political risk loss data, which is something that we've been using for years. And it pointed to the consensus in terms of the positive macroeconomic impact of the election as being, I think the word I used was myopic or delusional or in need of a psychiatric check. But that goes to your Frederick point about me being always very soft-spoken. So this is just an example. We were able to say to portfolio managers that the point they were making about strength in the banking sector as a result of Erdogan commitment, so-called commitment to certain policies, that did not reflect in credit loss, in political risk, and so forth. Anyhow, don't want to spend too much time on this, but I want to give you a sense of we're not entirely crazy when we talk about this. Okay, so the French elections. Let's get to the present, enough of the past. If you've gone online, you've probably seen this. This is I always tell my students, I teach at NYU, and some of them are here, never put a graph with more than a few lines. So as I was putting that, there are some arrows trying to make sense of this. You have the bottom two candidates and you have the top two candidates. So let's just disregard the bottom two, well, the middle two, the second tier two candidates. We're not seeing any evidence, even in the regular polls, that there is a Mélenchon surge or a Mélenchon surge. At the top, though, I do want to point out that they are under any of these three scenarios. So I've just taken you between the 1 year, the 1 month, and the 2-week scenarios. None of these are outside of the margin of errors. So basically, we need to realize that the entire news cycle of the last several weeks has been entirely useless. No offense. Didn't expect you to be there. My apologies there. Let me rephrase this. An economist can always argue from two perspectives. The news cycle has been extremely useful in really allowing us to focus on any specific day, on the micro changes in that. The issue is that it's within the margin of errors. And polls are indicative, but we must understand what the margin of error is. And it's exactly the same thing that we saw in the US. And I'll talk a bit about that later. Even though it's not Europe, we'll find it somewhat useful as a comparison. So our view is that you should not really, so there's 2 points here. Our first view is that when it comes to the election itself, we'll tell you where we think it's heading. We have a dominant scenario and an upset scenario. But also for us, not only is it an issue of the news cycle, but it's also an issue we must look when looking at a year or multi-year trend on issues such as membership in the EU, at issues such as the rise of extreme parties and so forth in larger trends, and look at a few years and many years and so forth. We must look at the underlying reasons from a polling standpoint, from a demographic standpoint, that drive people's priorities and votes. We must open up those elements. And when you are within a margin of error, that is even more important because you really can't say anything about that, but the underlying currents, those may not necessarily be in the margin of error. So you can do that through a traditional poll, or you can start looking at alternative data. And here is an actual list of actual data, first, second, third generation. I don't know how many of you know this, but these specifics, but they keep getting more detailed. The first generation was the news, was the web. The second one, well, within that, then Facebook, then Google, et cetera. Terms like being able to download the whole data, the Twitter host, et cetera, et cetera. Then we got into the second generation, which had to do with satellites. Everything was about satellites. Everything was about movements. Everything was about weather and terrain and so forth. Very interesting, we were just talking a bit earlier about that, about the importance of terrain and weather in country risk models and even in credit and economic models. Then the third generation, which is really happening recently, has been about micro satellites. I don't know how many of you live in New York or are on the co-op. In a co-op or are on the co-op board, which is one of the worst things. For those of you who don't know, it means that you basically have to sit with a bunch of boring people and debate issues of finance. So a macro drone would allow you to go and spy on people. So I have my annual meeting tonight. I'm going to talk about that. Not too many co-op owners, because normally that one gets a lot of laugh. So the issue is you can take this through. And here you have the columns on the key issues. For example, a gender gap, education gap, wealth gap, age gap, etc. And what I wanted you to see with this was kind of demystify it. You can see how each one can speak to the different elements, and there's a logic to that if you actually go into what Facebook is and so forth. So the far column, I'm looking at Le Pen, and I'm looking at some work we've done this week on integrating a bit of a stress test in old terms, the performance of Le Pen in these. So here's your example of how we apply this. I'll go very rapidly through this, but this is just to show you margins of error. The interesting thing, I actually know this presentation by heart, even though it's new, so thankfully, otherwise I need my glasses. So the interesting thing is that in the US, the average poll size is about 500. With that, you have a margin of error of almost like 5, plus or minus 5. When you go into the UK on Brexit, the poll size goes to about 2,000, 1,900. And when you get to France, they get to about 2,500. And that's based on the review I did a few days ago of, about like 500 polls and so forth. With that, you realize that the Trump-Clinton election was within the margin of error, the Brexit was within the margin of error, and the French is also within the margin of error. So when we talk about the failure of polls, they're not failing. It's just that society has gotten so much in the middle and the extremes that polls aren't necessarily the best tool. So again, context here to say, why are we coming back to big data? So this is applied to France, and where are the gaps? And then the average gap in the US between different constituencies was 25, and in France, it's either 7 or 2.8. It's 2.8 if you include the voting patterns of the 10% of French Muslims, or if you don't. Okay, so with all of that, you get to this little table here where you basically stress test, you adjust. This is a simplified version, but the polls. And you end up with a few scenarios that are in color. 2 out of 3 of them, Macron wins the first round. And in one case, which we value at 1 out of 3, you have Le Pen winning at 35%. Those are the added benefit that we get. In this case, really, what it gives us, I think, confirms a lot of what we expected. But it also shows that 1 out of 3 of 35% is a very strong possibility. And it certainly is not unlikely to happen. 1 out of 3 events happen quite often. You can just think of them in your own life. Okay. So that was for the French. The Germans, one word, had to. Not happening yet. Chancellor Merkel is still fairly strong, fairly leading. This little bump in the middle where they come together, which is the red line of her opponent, that's because he just came on the scene and so forth. Too early to break the trends. For those of you who are traders, polling is very much like trading the stock market. Okay. That is the French elections. Now, second part of the presentation. We're going to look at trends in Europe. Let me show some of my own versions here of interesting numbers. By the way, I love that polling thing. I thought it was the old-fashioned one and everything. I'm going to do that next time. Much better. So now I have to do this. So the top concerns are immigration, employment, almost the same, financial crisis. So pretty, immigration is up there compared to some of the latest reports. But let me come up with some interesting underlying currents which really drive the questions we have. What about trade? What about Brexit? What about the rise of the far right or even the far left right now in France? Opposed to free trade, overwhelming numbers. The US actually at 50, which considering that is the US. Opposed to immigration, Italy being at the top, which surprised me. And then you have all of the other ones. UK, interestingly, not at the top, even though they largely exited because of immigration. These views definitely are not mine, nor those of my company. Travel ban in Europe, favorite, above half, 60% on immigration ban. These are incredible numbers. I don't really care who and what Marine Le Pen does or what the position of a party in the Netherlands is when I see numbers like this. It's an issue of those numbers driving the political discourse and the political discourse reinforcing those, not the other way around. The one I really like, willing to support a military coup. No, it's not funny. It's funny the first time, but when you look at the numbers, it's not funny. And I'm going to do some numbers on this, and you'll see it's not funny. United Kingdom, UKIP. Okay, they're not mainstream, but they may get, 30%, or not in the British system, but 30% of polling. 44. UK at large, 25. France and Germany, interestingly, maybe because they've gone through some worse events, didn't say that, but let's expand now. How much do you think? Oh, great moment for a poll. How much do you think it is in the US? Yeah, right. GOP, 45%. Is that 45 or 43? It's 43 or 45, 43. All 37, Democrats 30. You don't need to be, any of these numbers are disturbing. It depends on how you ask the question. So just a little one on that. Are you willing to support a coup to defend the Constitution, if the government is legitimate or not? Okay, I think we might all be willing to say yes, you know. And then you follow up, how many of you think the government is not legitimate? 60% of GOP registered voters until the last election, 60%. Not making a political statement, just reading the numbers. These are the trends that drive what we're seeing in the political arena. We need to focus on understanding those more than necessarily looking at candidates when these candidates are in the margin of error, especially. This is simply adjusting those. If you adjust them for alternative data, you get to these numbers. You can see that in some cases you get above half opposition to immigration and so forth and so forth. I'm going to keep with this little one about military rule. You can get above 50% in the US and even higher depending on how you do it. So now let's look at this one. EU survival. When you adjust the numbers, you go from the public answer, which is, of course, we support the EU, to alternative data number 1, alternative data number 2, and it drops. I'll tell you the difference because it's a meaningful one, 47%. You're below. Euro survival, you're still below, but interestingly enough, you arrive with a Euro survival ahead of the EU, which is a scenario none of us are thinking about. But when you start thinking about it, you can justify it. Again, economists, we can justify almost anything, almost. But it's an interesting element. Suddenly the scenario comes to the fore, and we can start planning about it, something we probably wouldn't be planning otherwise. Okay. Do the same thing to, how much time do I have? Oh, fantastic. I've been going through them much more rapidly than I expected then. I'm going to slow down. So you can do the same thing with macroeconomics. In the context of macroeconomics, you look at, so we're switching gears here from polling again in the context of Europe to now macroeconomics in the context of Europe. The alternative data has been used for many, many years, way before it was called alternative or big data in the world of economics. To a large extent, the original ways of collecting information by the Fed were very much alternative data. I like to ask sometimes the audience and some of my colleagues, how does the Fed still collect information when it comes to GDP and other key figures? Some of you may remember Greenspan. He loved to look at factory orders. The way that is being done to this day is there is a certain number of firms that are quote, quote, constructed as a representative model of the economy, and they report both through numbers and spreadsheets and so forth, but also verbally, quantitative and qualitative, how that data goes in there. That is what we base the core of our forecast. And then you have, of course, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and so forth that is able to go into much more details, but we know that's not at the same rhythm. Now, when I was speaking with some central bankers a few weeks ago with regards to Turkey and bringing in credit insurance data, bringing in political risk, losses at banks and so forth, they thought that was alternative and unstructured. We're good friends, so they look and they smile and say, okay, great, Michel. Tell us about what the other central bankers and what the portfolio managers are thinking. But then I say, okay, you can use a drone, and you've probably used this one, you heard about this one, and we'll have a drone and we'll simply look at everything that goes in and out of some key factories. You'll have it instantly. That's even more structured than the way you're doing it. Much easier also. Still not structured. One of the things that we're seeing is there is an obstacle to change and to technology adoption. And that goes without saying. The reality, though, is that once we come to understand that this is a continuity of what we were doing, then it becomes much easier to integrate this within these elements. The tables I've shown you are an approach to artificial intelligence that's really called enhanced intelligence. And for those of you looking to adapt or to adopt rather alternative data, big data, and so forth, this element of transitioning is the most important. Let me give you an example, which a colleague of mine used, which I thought was the best. So I'm giving him credit, my friend Manish. I don't like driving. Okay? I like to be in the back seat with someone driving for me. So, yeah, I have to drive myself, obviously, but that's not what I like. So I would be the first person to love having an automated car. So not only am I into technology, but I'm also super eager to just let the machine do it. Then there's the Lexus model, and there's the Google model. The Lexus model, you sit in the car, and you can take control and everything. It's enhanced. It's going to help you. You can go to sleep for a little while. It's going to wake you up. You move a bit like that. It's going to beep and so forth. I'm OK with that. I want that. The Google model, some of you may have seen it on YouTube. You get in the car. There's nothing else. You just look around, and you're like in a little, fun little car, like a 1970s sci-fi movie. I would never touch that car. And I totally believe technology, but you're never going to see me in there. That's exactly what all of us are confronted with when it comes to adopting artificial intelligence. We're being asked to make a jump that is way too significant to do with comfort. We're being asked to move beyond the way we've been doing things for many years. So this approach that I'm trying to lay here, that I'm trying to go into greater granularity, has to do with this enhanced approach to intelligence, to artificial intelligence. Okay. We are at COFAS. Very glad to be here, as we said. And I would like to talk finally about what work we've been doing for 20 years, upon which all of this work on alternative data is based, which is our work with using insurance data from a variety of insurance lines to provide insight into macroeconomic trends. Not just country risk, but larger macroeconomic trends. So we produce, I would probably say the only people in the world who do it on a more comprehensive way than us is our good friends at COFAS. They have one of the best country risk handbook out there. I've been using it for many years. So we use those data, and we focus on business interruption, credit, political, property casualty as well. We've expanded to more quote, mainstream lines. So we provide ratings for country risk, etc., which we use in the context, for example, of our analysis of Turkey and its economy and its growth. But we also, this is our win thing for this year, so if you can see it, it's there. But we also use it to look at larger trends when it comes to what we're discussing. So credit default, EU increasing. We're expecting it to go a bit down. So basically, we're seeing improvements. That was interesting for what you were saying earlier. Slight improvement in terms of default rates. And then, you can see them better than me. I haven't memorized those yet. Again, the importance here is to look at what you've been doing and to relate this alternative data into a framework that suits what you want to study, what you want to look at. And then I think I have my little quote for the end. I always say that when looking at data, at AI, or any of this, at trying to enhance, it's something you need to know, something you don't know, and something you can do about. So I hope today that I demonstrated that there is an added advantage to using alternative data. I hope that you can see at the same time it's not a panacea, that there are conditions under which it's not worth going into using it, the added work. If the gap is 10% in an election, if the GDP is on a very clear trend, you may not need to. But if there are moments where you're in doubt, you want to look at underlying components, then it is very useful. So you have the element here about where we've talked about Le Pen. The EU probability, that came as a surprise. I think it's something we need to look into. And then you have the last one. So one last word that I'd like to mention. I came across the statistics reviewing this, doing the research for this. In the first 25 years after the Reformation, from the moment Luther put his thing on the door, on the church door, his declaration, 27 years, literacy grew from 20% to 60% on average in Western Europe, because of the printing press, the books, and so forth, and suddenly books were everywhere, et cetera, et cetera. In the last 25 years, since the web has been around, web penetration has gone from 19% to 59%, 20 to 60, 20 to 60, basically. Why is that interesting to me? That's interesting to me because I tried to look at one-year trends and so forth. But even bigger than that, what that discovery of sudden information flow led to was not the Rousseau view of the Enlightenment or the Burke view of the Enlightenment, but it was much more an issue of instability and the wars of religion and so forth. And one would be surprised not to see similar comparable dislocations today. Similarly, so that's the one thing I want to leave you on that thought. The other thought also I want to leave on is going back to these elements of anti-immigrants, anti-Semitism, and these different antis that we see that suddenly we're very surprised about. If you take a 50-year look at polls, for however long we've had polls, if you look at elections in the 30s in Europe, you will find that it is extremely interesting that there is always about a 27 to 33 threshold of extremist views in Western democracies, or quasi-democracies, if you go back to those years. What we're seeing right now is that those extremist views are also linked to about 25 to 30%, and if adjusted for alternative data, which really gives a more personal look at things, you get to that 35. So you have a third of the population that goes in and out of the public discourse, but it doesn't seem to go away. So once again, two different historical perspectives, and then very specifics about this, and a context for using alternative data. So I hope that was useful, and there it is. Thank you so much.